Thank you, Gordon and the Chamber Singers. We gather as a community each year at this time, the birthday of Robert E. Lee, by charge of the Board of Trustees. The purpose of this remembrance has appropriately broadened over time. It is now an occasion to recognize and celebrate leadership and its centrality to Washington and Lee's mission. And not just leadership, but a particular kind of leadership, one with integrity, honor, and service to others as its defining qualities. We will have other occasions throughout this week to reflect on leadership as we celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King, and as we witness an historic transition in our nation's top political offices. This is both a hopeful and a challenging time in our nation's history, perhaps even a time of transformation. It calls upon us as a nation to be ambitious and humble, confident in our ability to meet the challenges and aware of the sacrifice that will be necessary. There is yet another birthday we celebrate this year of someone perhaps less well known. If he were alive today, the influential British philosopher Isaiah Berlin would be 100 years old. He is my reality check, and somewhat in honor of his birthday, and somewhat to seek clarification about the meaning of the momentous events of this week, I found myself scanning one of his essays recently, and here's what he wrote. Happy are those who live under a discipline which they accept without question, who freely obey the orders of leaders, spiritual or temporal, whose word is fully accepted as unbreakable law. Or those who have, by their own methods, arrived at clear and unshakable convictions about what to do and what to be that brook no possible doubt. I can only say that those who rest on such comfortable beds of dogma are victims of self-induced myopia, blinkers that may make for contentment, but not for understanding what it is to be human. End of quote. I know not what awaits us in the months and years to come, but I hope that as we approach our task, we do so aware of the danger of certitude, accepting the inevitability of complexity, and sensitive to the need for a humility that allows us to learn from others who do not see things the way we do. That's a hope for all of us in our roles as citizens of this country, but also for all of us as members of this Washington and Lee community. There's another reason for us to think about leadership today. We honor several individuals chosen for membership in Omicron Delta Kappa, the National Leadership Honor Society founded here in 1914. It now has chapters or circles at over 300 colleges and universities throughout the country. The form of leadership we embrace at Washington and Lee springs from the character and virtue of those individuals who have left their imprint on us. ODK is an extension of our institutional values, influencing how leadership is understood not just here, but for nearly a century on college campuses throughout the country. I congratulate those honored today by their induction into ODK and express our deepest appreciation for helping us continue that legacy. I now have the honor to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Jack Goldsmith. He is a Washington and Lee alumnus who graduated with a BA summa cum laude in 1984. He then earned a second BA from a place called Oxford University in 1986, a JD from Yale Law School in 1989, an MA First Class from honors from Oxford in 1991, and a diploma from the Hague Academy of International Law in 1992. He clerked for Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson III on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and for Justice Anthony Kennedy of the Supreme Court of the United States from 1990 to 91. Before joining the Harvard Law faculty, he was a professor at the University of Chicago Law School and the University of Virginia Law School. He's a prolific writer, and his most recent book is called The Terror Presidency, Law and Judgment Inside the Bush Administration. But there is more to Jack's story, of course. 3 years into the Bush presidency, he became head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice. That is the office that provides legal opinions on a range of issues, including such matters as the authority of the president and the executive branch. When he arrived, he was presented with a number of opinions on what the president and those in his charge could do or not do in the war against terrorism, whether it was domestic surveillance or the detention and interrogation of prisoners or a host of other issues. In his words, "I was immensely worried to discover that some of our most important counterterrorism policies rested on severely damaged legal foundations. It began to dawn on me that I could not, as I thought I would eventually be asked to do, stand by or affirm these opinions." What Mr. Goldsmith did in that situation provides an all too rare example of leadership, personal courage, and intellectual and personal integrity. We are proud to call him an alumnus and to welcome him as our keynote speaker today. Jack?
Thank you very much, President Ruscio. President Ruscio, faculty, members and initiates of ODK, members of the university community, guests, and friends. It is a signal honor for me to speak to you today on Founders Day. I entered Washington and Lee as a freshman 28 years ago, as a young man with little ambition and even less education. My wonderful teachers at W&L, some of whom I see here today, taught me to love ideas and sparked in me a self-confidence that I lacked before and without which it is hard to succeed in life. To them, I will always be grateful. I will always be grateful as well to this great university, not only for its outstanding teachers, but just as important for its culture of honor, a culture we inherited from our founders, George Washington and Robert E. Lee, and a culture that ingrains in us the importance of personal integrity in all that we do. Today and tomorrow are obviously important days for our country as we transfer power from one president to another. I want to reflect with you on this transition and more generally on the presidency in the age of terrorism that began on September 11th, 2001. President Bush leaves office today, viewed by many a failure. But today's judgment will not necessarily be the judgment of history. Writing about the Kennedy administration soon after JFK's assassination, the great historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. cautioned that we are always in a zone of imperfect visibility so far as the history just over our shoulder is concerned. Every generation judges a recent presidency based on what Schlesinger called its distinctive preoccupation of the present. Later generations, however, know more about the hidden challenges and accomplishments of a presidential administration, and they have different priorities, concerns, and values that color their judgments about the past. The result, Schlesinger noted, is that presidential reputations rise and fall like stocks on Wall Street, determined by the supply and demand equations of a later age. The reputations of Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt declined during the 15 years after they died, but subsequently rose very high. Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower are considered much greater presidents now than when they left office. Even history's judgment of George Washington has fluctuated quite a bit. There's no way now to know for sure, but the seeds for a future upward revision in President Bush's stature, at least in the area of national security, may lie in what I think is his most extraordinary accomplishment, the prevention of a terrorist attack on a homeland since 9/11. This seemed impossible in the days and weeks after 9/11, when most people expected that terrorist attacks would become commonplace and that our way of life had changed forever. But this has not happened. It has not happened, I believe, based on my experiences in government, because of the literally unceasing efforts of President Bush and his counterterrorism team to identify, track, disrupt, kill, and take other aggressive actions against the self-described jihadists who want to destroy our civilization. It is easy to imagine a sharp change in President Bush's standing if future presidents, employing different tactics, are less successful in keeping us safe. Whether this happens or not, and obviously I don't know whether it will happen, none of us do, I'm sure that the Bush administration counterterrorism officials are celebrating today the fact that the terrorists have not attacked the United States since 9/11. When I worked in the government, these officials believed that the personal opprobrium that they suffered for their counterterrorism policies would be worth it if they left office having kept Americans safe. But if Bush administration officials are celebrating the prevention of a second attack, few others in the country seem to be doing so. In fact, public concern about terrorism has dropped precipitously since 9/11. This is unsurprising, and not just because the economic crisis has taken center stage. For there have been very few signs at home since 9/11 of any real threat. There has been no follow-up attack, no draft, little mobilization, relatively few casualties compared to past wars, no shortages, rationing, or economic controls. The public sees no menacing enemy army battalions, much less decisive victories, such as the battles at Midway or Gettysburg. Success against the terrorists is largely invisible and consists mostly in capturing or killing them before they hurt us. Indeed, the best evidence of our success against the terrorists, the absence of a second homeland attack, has had the self-defeating effect of raising public skepticism about the reality of the threat. A democracy cannot fight a 7 years war, said the great VMI graduate, General George C. Marshall. It is especially hard for a democracy to fight a war for more than 7 years, which is where we are now, when there are few public signs of threat. Unfortunately, however, the threat has not diminished. And many people are naturally and understandably skeptical of this view when the Bush administration warns about terror threats. But there are credible bipartisan voices looking at the same evidence who tell the same story. Last autumn, the leaders of the 9/11 Commission, Lee Hamilton and Thomas Keane, explained why they believed we are dangerously vulnerable, in their words, to nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks by terrorists. And they warned that, again in their words, the threat of a new major terrorist attack on the United States is still very real. Last month, a different bipartisan commission examined the classified intelligence extensively and reached a similar conclusion. In their words, terrorists are determined to attack us again with weapons of mass destruction if they can. After documenting our vulnerability to nuclear and especially biological attack, the report stated that, quote, our margin of safety is shrinking, not growing, and concluded that unless the world community acts decisively and with great urgency, and again, this is their words, it is more likely than not that a weapon of mass destruction will be used in a terrorist attack somewhere in the world by the end of 2013. These alarming words did not come from scaremongering Bush officials, but rather from, among others, a former Democratic senator and Democratic congressman, a Harvard professor not prone to scaremongering about terrorism, a Clinton administration State Department official, and a former aide to Senator Harry Reid and Congressman John Murtha. Now, if betting were allowed in Lee Chapel, I would wager that very few of you knew about either of these extraordinary warnings or the factual analyses that underlies them. I would also wager that many of you are skeptical of these claims, even though they come from bipartisan sources. 7.5 years of frightening threat reports, followed by the absence of attack, have deadened us all to warnings of attack. The president, however, has not stopped worrying about this threat. He cannot afford to, because we expect him to keep us safe, and we blame him and no one else when the terrorists strike. The whole government is so identified in the minds of the people with his personality, said President William Howard Taft, that they make him, the president, responsible for all the sins of omission and commission of society at large. Nowhere is Taft's dictum truer than with national security. Now, the large and growing gap between the president's worried attitude toward the threat and the public's relatively indifferent attitude toward it is an enormous problem for the presidency in the age of terrorism, or the terror presidency as I call it in my book. It is a problem for the terror presidency because keeping the country safe from our lethal and very patient enemies requires extraordinary and sometimes controversial steps. If the public perceives a serious national security threat, it will give him strong support and wide latitude in meeting it. But when the public does not share a president's assessment of a national security threat, the president has a hard time doing what he needs to meet it. Let me give you some examples. In 1998, the Clinton administration had a plan to attack and, if necessary, kill Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. It declined to do so, in part because it realized that the public perceived no serious threat from bin Laden at the time, 1998, and thus would not support the action against him, especially if, as it seemed likely, it was perceived as unlawful and resulted in collateral damage to civilians and civilian property. Almost 6 decades earlier, in the spring and summer of 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt worried intensely that Great Britain would fall before the Nazi onslaught. Roosevelt wanted to help, but he declined Winston Churchill's desperate pleas for U.S. naval destroyers to stave off the Nazis. Roosevelt explained to Churchill that he lacked legal authority to give Churchill the destroyers, and that the isolationist Congress, reflecting the isolationist sentiment in the country, would not support it. By September, the fall of that year, however, FDR had changed his mind and had given Churchill the destroyers in exchange for the British naval bases. Why did Roosevelt change his mind? Congress had done nothing in the interim. There had been no changes in the law. But public sentiment had shifted a great deal after the brutal Nazi aerial bombings of Great Britain that summer. Just as few people worried about the legal niceties of FDR's destroyers deal, few people cared when John F. Kennedy violated the UN Charter in quarantining Cuba during the missile crisis. The public necessity for the action was obvious. We have forgiven Abraham Lincoln's many violations of the Constitution during the Civil War because we understand that he acted to meet a genuine crisis. And likewise, most people have given the benefit of the doubt to Franklin Roosevelt's many legally dubious wartime actions. Not just the destroyers were bases deal with Great Britain, but also his surveillance of suspected domestic subversives in disregard of a federal wiretapping statute. Does that sound familiar? His probably unconstitutional seditious prosecutions, and even to some degree, his exclusion of Japanese Americans and others from the West Coast. The lesson here is well summed up by Abraham Lincoln. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. The President of the United States is empowered and constrained in the short run and especially in the medium run by what the public will support. But what the public will support depends a great deal on what the public believes. And for the most part, the public believes what it sees. The problem for the terror presidency is that the public cannot see the terror threat. The public is increasingly skeptical that the terror threat exists, and the public is increasingly worried about the president's pretensions to exercise war powers to meet it. This is an unusual and dangerous state of affairs, I think. For more than ever, we need a strong and vigilant presidency to keep us safe. Now, the president could, of course, eliminate or at least reduce public skepticism about the threat by disclosing the frightening information he possesses about terrorist aims and plans, and that the bipartisan commissions I mentioned have about terrorist aims and plans. But such disclosures would be self-defeating, for they would tip off the enemy to how we gathered it and make us much less safe. What then can the president do to address this problem, to overcome this gap between his perception of the threat and the people's? The problem is a difficult one, and it has no great solution. But the least bad solution, the necessary solution, is for the president to establish and maintain that most important yet most elusive of presidential qualities, public trust. And here we come to what I believe is one of the most consequential failures of the Bush administration. Whether by design or by accident, I think it is something of both. President Bush and his advisors did not pay great attention to the need to establish and maintain public trust concerning the terror threat. Nothing could have undermined public trust in presidential threat assessments more than a war in Iraq that was premised on claims about a terror-related threat of weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to be true. And public trust was, of course, further shaken by the horrible pictures from Abu Ghraib, which, when viewed in conjunction with the flawed Department of Justice interrogation opinions, led many to believe, incorrectly in my view, but nonetheless quite understandably led many to believe, that the president had sought the authority to torture prisoners. Beyond these deeply unfortunate events, the greatest contributor to mistrust of presidential claims about the terror threat was the administration's public posture towards the president's own powers. President Bush never seemed to understand what Lincoln and Roosevelt and other great wartime presidents understood: the vital, ongoing need to convince the citizenry that the president is using his extraordinary war powers for public good and not for personal or institutional aggrandizement. This failure of understanding manifested itself in many ways, but I will briefly mention only two. The first was the Bush administration's eschewal of congressional consultation and support, and its reliance instead on unilateral presidential war powers to establish military commissions, to engage in warrantless electronic surveillance of suspected terrorists, to detain alleged enemy soldiers without charge or trial, and more. This go-it-alone strategy deprived the administration of its best opportunity to speak credibly about the terror threat. The president can share more national security data with Congress than with the public. And when Congress, after it sees this information, supports aggressive policies based on this information, the nation, the citizenry, is much more likely to accept that the president is acting in good faith. The Bush administration's unilateral surveillance policies, for example, sparked huge worries about an out-of-control presidency. But when the administration finally sought congressional approval for these policies, 20 Democrats in the Senate and 128 Democrats in the House joined Republicans to give it to him in a law that was passed last summer. The bipartisan support for new presidential surveillance powers made it much harder for critics to maintain that the president was aggrandizing power, or that the terror threat did not warrant such power. But the failure to seek congressional support earlier deprived the country of a responsible and enlightening debate about the stakes of the terror threat. And it raised suspicions that the president was acting to increase his own powers than to keep the country safe. The second credibility-destroying mistake, and as far as I know, a mistake that in its extreme is unprecedented in American presidential history, was the administration's open chest thumping about the importance of maintaining and expanding its own executive power. The public worries a lot about presidential war power in time of war. This was as true in World War II and the Civil War as it is today. And a prudent president tries to assuage these concerns and to meet them. Lincoln and Roosevelt were as powerful as any presidents we ever had, but they never talked publicly about the need to expand their power as a matter of principle. Doing so would have been self-defeating and, frankly, politically stupid. When they exercised extraordinary authorities as they did so with a grudging public face, with expressions of respect for constitutional values, and with explanations about why the steps were an unfortunate but necessary mean to an important national security end. The Bush administration, by contrast, accompanied its aggressive counterterrorism policies with an open agenda to expand presidential power, an agenda that led it to make broad public statements about untouchable presidential powers that were entirely unnecessary to the task at hand. When an administration makes little attempt to work with the other institutions of our government and makes it a public priority to emphasize its aim to expand its power, Congress, the courts, and the public understandably become deeply suspicious of the president's motives in taking aggressive steps to keep us safe. These mistakes did great harm to the Bush administration and will always, I think, dim the luster of the administration's extraordinary accomplishment in keeping us safe in the last 7.5 years. This brings me to the second terror presidency that begins tomorrow, the administration of Barack Obama. Predictions at the outset of an administration about how a president will use his powers are at least as fraught as judging a presidency on the day it ends, for we do not know for sure what challenges the new president will face or how he will react to them. I remember well the historian Michael Beckloss wrote an editorial in December of 2000, just after the election, saying that the imperial presidency had come to an end and whoever assumed the presidency, Gore or Bush, would have significantly reduced powers. So I realize that any judgments and predictions are fraught. I nonetheless think it's safe to make two predictions about the Obama administration as it relates to the war on terrorism. The first is that the new administration will not cease to be very aggressive in meeting the terror threat. Law professor Peter Spiro captured the views of many when he said that the election of Barack Obama means that the war on terror is over and that terrorism is no longer likely to pose the peremptory threat that it has since 9/11. As I've already suggested, I think this is wrong. President Obama will read the same threat reports as President Bush. He will inherit the same challenge of stopping Islamist terrorists who hide among civilians and who want to use ever smaller and more deadly weapons to disrupt our way of life. And he will realize that he alone will be blamed if and when the terrorists strike, especially as his administration progresses. President Obama will no doubt change tactics in responding to this threat, and he will certainly wrap his counterterrorism policies in softer and more attractive packaging than his predecessor. It would be hard not to do so. But his responsibility to keep Americans safe, a responsibility that President Harry Truman described as so personal as to be without parallel, will induce him, like President Bush and all terror presidencies for the foreseeable future, to meet the frightening and difficult to detect threat aggressively and preemptively. We have already seen President Obama expressing this attitude in many ways since the election. The second prediction is that President Obama will do a much better job than President Bush of overcoming the The second prediction is that President Obama will do a much better job than President Bush of overcoming the presidential trust deficit. Again, it would be hard not to. Some of this renewed trust naturally attaches to any new presidency, and some will appear by virtue of the road that this particular president has traveled. When the critic of the Iraq invasion and a skeptic about a war framework for counterterrorism warns us about the harrowing threat the terrorists pose, as I think he inevitably will, he will speak with considerably more credibility than President Bush ever could. The president-elect's words and deeds since November suggest that he will take other steps to enhance trust in the presidency and thus presidential effectiveness as it relates to the war on terrorism. In particular, he seems set on embracing the tenets of democratic leadership that Presidents Roosevelt and Lincoln used to enhance presidential trust during their wars. First, like Roosevelt and to some degree Lincoln, President Obama has put in place a bipartisan and pragmatic national security team. This will help to establish that the president's national security actions are in the public interest and not in the partisan interest. Second, and also like our two greatest war presidents, President Obama seems committed to genuine consultation with and consent from Congress. If successful, this will spread responsibility for our national security policies and help convince the public that the threat is real and requires extraordinary measures. Third, the president-elect has promised a less secretive executive branch. If this comes to pass, it will reduce the mistakes that excessive secrecy brings and produce a more responsible and prudent government. Fourth, President Obama has promised to openly embrace constitutional values in educating the nation about the security threat, a posture obviously better designed than its Bush administration opposite to secure public trust. If President Obama follows through on these steps, he will, I think, help to narrow the public's hazardous skepticism about the reality of the threats we face. Let us hope that these efforts will strengthen the second terror presidency such that if it exercises good judgment and is lucky, it can prevent the second and more devastating attack that many experts believe is inevitable, an attack that, if it occurs, will change our nation in ways that will make George W. Bush seem like a civil libertarian. Thank you very much.